Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for the sixth in a 70-part series as we journey short story by short story through the Finca Vigia edition, the complete short stories of one Ernest Hemingway. And a this is a quirky little short story unless you once you kind of get it, oh, well, that's not a quirky little short story at all. That's awful. That's horrible. That's miserable. That is what happens to people from the powers that be. So, the On the Quay at Smyrna is the short story in question. We have three sections to this video: a So What Happened section, a Lit Crit section, and finally, a Writer's Corner section. So, what happened in On the Quay at Smyrna? We are given the recounts of what sounds like a British officer on the Greco-Turkish War. We think this is a British officer because of the speech patterns and the way that Hemingway would often put the speech patterns and sort of or verbal tics, I should say, as well as some word choice that would have been representative in larger Hemingway canon of what the British sounded like. You need to look no further than the short story, The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber. Why couldn't I think of that name? Anyway, and here's how this short story starts. I'm going to read you about about a quarter of the short story with the opening paragraph. "The strange thing was," he said, "how they screamed every night at midnight. I do not know why they screamed at that time. We were in the harbor, and they were all on the pier, and at midnight they started screaming. We used to turn the searchlight on them to quiet them. That always did the trick. We'd run the searchlight up and down over them 2 or 3 times, and they stopped it. One time I was senior officer on the pier, and a Turkish officer came up to me in a frightful rage because one of our sailors had been most insulting to him. So I told him the fellow would be sent on the ship and be most severely punished. I asked him to point him out. So he pointed out a gunner's mate, most inoffensive chap. Said he'd been most frightfully and repeatedly insulting, talking to me through an interpreter. I couldn't imagine how the gunner's mate knew enough Turkish to be insulting. I called him over and said, 'And just in case you should have spoken to any Turkish officers.' 'I haven't spoken to any of them, sir.' 'I'm quite sure of it,' I said, 'but you'd best go on board the ship and not come ashore again for the rest of the day.' But that's not all. That's not all that happens here in the wages of war. The spoils of war are constant, like how women refuse to give up their dead babies. You have to forcibly take them from these women after about a week or so. Or how when an agrarian people are forced to move, we get this. This is the final paragraph. The Greeks were nice chaps too. When they evacuated, they had all their baggage animals they couldn't take off with them, so they just broke their forelegs and dumped them into the shallow water. All those mules with their forelegs broken pushed over into the shallow water. It was all a pleasant business. My word, yes, a most pleasant business." And that leads me into the one sort of literary criticism that I think there is to speak about here. We kind of get some idea of who. So remember that tinge of sort of. Depending on your reading, it could be arrogance. Depending on your reading, it could be sarcasm. Depending on your reading, it could be just complete abject removal from the situation. Oh, yeah, it was all great stuff. Which is in itself sort of a sarcastic thing, but not pure sarcasm, just dismissive, right? We know a little bit about who the speaker is, probably a British officer, etc. What do we know about who the speaker is speaking to? There is an implied, so it's a little bit meta, right? Because the speaker, the protagonist is the British officer. The speaker is the second person in this story, an implied second person. The implied second person is the one actually speaking to us, the reader. The strange thing was, he said, whoever this individual is that's putting in the he said, that's the second person. I don't think it matters who that person is, and here is why I think that is so devastating. This short story, 300, 400 words, probably 350, somewhere in there. The entirety of this story is not what is said. The entirety of this short story is that it is said. This speaker, especially British as he may be, is supposed to be stiff upper lip, Take it and keep going, chap. We're not supposed to care about these things that we saw in war. These things that he saw in war are not supposed to have broken him. It is his duty to have done them. It is his duty to have been there. It is his duty to take these terrible things with him for the rest of his life. It's what he's supposed to do. That's what he's told to do. That's what he's told is his lot in life. How miserable. The second party in this story doesn't matter, because what matters is that our actual protagonist, the British officer, is having to say these things because he's having to deal with them. He is having himself to get this off of his consciousness at some level, in some way. And the only way that he can think to process this is by slating out those words, and it doesn't matter to who. Probably the officer doesn't even know. Maybe our speaker, our second party in this poem, not the officer, the other person. Maybe that's just the guy who was unlucky enough to be sitting next to him at the bar. It could be so simple as that. And because the officer doesn't have the tools to deal with these things, for the love of God, who would? He has to dollop on this dismissive type of humor, isn't it? The strange thing was how they screamed every night at midnight. That's the strange thing? The worst were the women with the babies. The women with the dead babies. The worst were the women with the babies. It's not even very straightforward the way these things are presented to us. All the way up until we get to that last paragraph. Oh, the Greeks were nice chaps too. When they evacuated, they all had their baggage animals they couldn't take off with them. So they just broke their legs and dumped them into the shallow water. All those mules with their legs broken pushed off into the shallow water. It was all a very pleasant business. My word, yes. A most pleasant business. This individual has seen things that he does not want to have to process, does not want to have to deal with, and for the love of Christ doesn't want to have to take with him. But he's forced to try to do all of these things because they're his now. Because you had to join the army and you had to do these things. And when you're in the army and you're doing these things, you go where they tell you to go. You do what they tell you to do. And even though these things, we're assuming this is a British officer, these things are not his war, having to be there for them, having to be there on the outside of things, completely disconnected, they're still his to deal with. This entire short story is, in my opinion, the TV static of a man who cannot process the stories going on inside the box, right? So there's the TV. Remember the old TVs? You'd have the snow and the waves on the screen, but every once in a while you could hear a little bit in the behind those waves. You could hear a little bit under that snow. The dialogue of the television show that was supposed to be on Channel 19, but you couldn't get Channel 19, not really. But sometimes you could kind of hear it. This metaphor means nothing to anyone 10 days younger than me, but I remember those days. Those days that you would have channels you did not have, but you could sometimes get part of the dialogue under the snow, behind the waves and static. That's what we have here. The officer, the British officer, is the television. The stories going on in his head are there behind the stoic facade of static. The stoic, static facade that society says he has to wear. Still, that channel is playing. Those things are going on, aren't they? All that stuff is under there. And he can't deal with it. But someone is sat next to him at the bar, and they can kind of hear the dialogue under the static. That's what's going on here. So, what about Writer's Corner? What are some things that we can talk about to make us a better writer from this short story? I think we have to go no further than the opening paragraph. "The strange thing was," he said, "how they screamed every night at midnight." Talk about in media res, right? Talk about in the middle of things. One of the strong things about opening paragraphs, when they are strong opening paragraphs, is oftentimes they begin what is called in media res. They begin what is known as in the middle of things. You don't have to run up to the story. You just put someone smack dab in the middle of it, and we understand things are happening. So you open a short story with a character's feet pat 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 patting against the concrete as fast as he can drive them. You know that A, our protagonist is a man, B, he's running, C, he's either running to something or from something. So automatically we have the elements of a story. "The strange thing was," he said, which implies that there's a normal thing. But the strange thing was, he said, which implies there is a he speaking, and he's speaking to someone else, "how they screamed every night at midnight." Now, that makes us wonder, why are they screaming at midnight? We never get the answer. We don't understand why it is that the searchlight shuts them up. I do not know why they screamed at that time, which implies he knows why they were screaming. I do not know why they screamed at that time, but I do know why they were screaming. We were in the harbor and they were all on the pier, and at midnight, they started screaming. We still have this mystery of why they're screaming. We used to turn the searchlight on them to quiet them. That always did the trick. We'd run the searchlight up and down over them 2 or 3 times, and they stopped it. How creepy is that? We still, by the way, don't know who they is. We still, by the way, are forced to look at something, someone's, when he is telling us that we would run the searchlight over them 2 or 3 times. We see that in our mind. We're forced to paint that picture. We have to populate it later. One time, I was senior officer on the pier, and a Turkish officer came up to me in a frightful rage because one of our sailors had been most insulting to him. This gives us the idea of the military, right? We get from that the understanding that there's military involved. We don't have it before then. We don't need it before then. And we couldn't process it a moment later in the short story. This is the brilliance of Ernest Hemingway. We get from that the idea that there is a relationship between the Turkish and whoever our speaker is. We get from, so this next one, so I told him the fellow would be sent on the ship and be most severely punished. Now, we get from that statement alone, but from a little bit later we understand it. So that's not, I told him that this would happen, means it didn't happen, right? So we understand that not only is our officer here, we know he's an officer, we don't know he's British at this point. We know that our officer here has some level of dismissive authority over the Turkish. He said this guy was giving him the business, so I told him, look, I'll take care of it. Now go away. Right? That is a dynamic between people here. So just it's a small thing, but it's added in just a couple words. It's a small thing, but it's added in just a couple words that is so easy to absorb, but simple to write. So he pointed out the gunner's mate, most inoffensive chap. This tells us there's a gunner. This tells us there's a gunner's mate. And this tells us that whoever this guy is who's telling the story knows these people, most inoffensive chap. He was an inoffensive guy. He was a nice guy. What's this guy talking about? It also tells us a little bit, perhaps, about the Turkish officer. Is this guy just causing as many problems as he can? Does he have something against this gunner's mate? And why did he pick him? I couldn't imagine the gunner's mate knew enough Turkish to be insulting. Now we get a little bit of a different understanding of this dynamic. This is just this officer being a prick. Do you have to know someone's language to be offensive? No. There are all sorts of things from a cultural divide as large as between the British and the Turkish that could offend someone simply by not knowing. Surely you can think of no shortage. And he's saying, this guy was probably lying to me. I don't really care. He was probably lying to me. I can vouch for the gunner's mate. I called him over and said, and just in case, you should have spoken to any Turkish officers. So, we get here a couple things. And it's it's a strange couple things. The first thing that we get from that sentence is that we know that he's being dismissive. I called him over and said, just in case you've talked to any Turkish officers. But the second thing that we get there is a little bit more of that story has been cut out. A little bit more of that story is missing. Why? How strange is this? And just in case, right? You don't start speaking to someone with the word and just in case. Some of that dialogue has been cut out, omitted by the person telling the story. Which means there's something there that the storyteller does not want to tell us, right? So all of that can happen in just a first paragraph. All of these dynamics can happen. All of this terror of war can happen, can be communicated to us in 350 words. Just a masterful short story by Ernest Hemingway. That's all I have for this short story. We will be back next week with Indian Camp, one of the more contentious, in my experience, one of the more contentious short stories from Ernest Hemingway because of his iceberg principle. We have a very good example of the iceberg principle here with this short story, in that all we're getting is the 10% of the word story, but there's 90% of it going on under the water, right? That is what the iceberg principle is. Indian Camp is one of these that you are sort of forced into your own interpretation through the length of that short story. And Hemingway leaves a lot of possibilities open in that short story. So once you make your conclusion about, what's that story about? Well, it's about a guy who's taking his son out to do some stuff for an Indian tribe. But what's it about, right? What's the underlying about to this short story? There's a lot of stuff there. Anyway, that's all I have for this short story discussion. This is appearing in two separate playlists. Number one being the short story discussion playlist. Number two being the Ernest Hemingway read along. Check out both of those playlists on the channel if that's something that you might be interested in. Hitting the like button really does help me out on the channel, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, there is poetry on the channel every Monday. We are currently doing this read along of Ernest Hemingway. We are doing a read along for Stephen King's latest novel. We are doing a read along with Dubliners by James Joyce, and a read along of Sylvia Plath's poetry as well. And I hope to have you back for the next one.